Amongst those watching this program, there may be one of you at least who knows or strongly suspects the person responsible.
His grim spree sparked the biggest police manhunt in history, yet the killer was never caught. And this was despite Scotland Yard putting their top detective on the case, the legendary John DeRose.
We hoped to start him up, to get him frightened, to make him run, to do something which would point the finger towards his guilt.
Lots of people put forward different theories about the identity of the killer, but frankly, only one really stands out. And if we could prove this theory, it has every possibility of delivering to the Metropolitan Police something that they didn't have 50 years ago. And that's a genuine prime suspect. The suspect in question's story begins 150 miles away in Abertillery in 1921. There are events that happened there almost 100 years ago that could hold the key to unlocking this mystery. A 15-year-old boy was convicted of a gruesome double child murder. And those murders have chilling parallels with the Hammersmith nude murders. But can those parallels be measured to build a convincing case that the boy killer went on to become a serial killer? Our search has been supported by a series of extraordinary interviews with the suspect's own daughter.
I couldn't believe it. I thought, my dad hasn't killed anybody. The man that I knew as my dad was a murderer.
All I want are some answers to an enduring mystery. Answers, moreover, that might take us one step forward to identifying the man that the press called Jack the Stripper.
I'm David Wilson, Emeritus Professor of Criminology. Myself and a team of experts travelled to Abertillery in South Wales. In 1921, a double child murder shocked the bustling market town. The murderer was a 15-year-old boy called Harold Jones. We examined his crimes to identify his signature, or deadly calling card, as a murderer. In this episode, we head to London to look at the Jack the Stripper murders, where a killer, who was never caught, took the lives of 6 women. We're looking to see if the signature of Harold Jones can be found in any of those deaths, and in doing so, take us any closer to answering the question: did Harold Jones the boy killer mature into a serial killer?
Victim number 1, Hannah Tailford, a 30-year-old prostitute. On February the 2nd, 1964, her body was fished out of the Thames at Hammersmith. Victim number 2, Irene Lockwood. Her body was found in the River Thames at Chiswick 2 months later. Victim number 3,
Beginning on the banks of the Thames in February 1964, Scotland Yard were about to find themselves dealing with a killer, the likes of which they hadn't seen since Jack the Ripper. The Jack the Stripper murders have never been subjected to a full examination by a team with modern policing techniques. The hope is that by revisiting the decades-old case, we may uncover previously unknown clues about the killer's modus operandi and his signature, and to see if any of these match the crimes of Harold Jones.
the whole of West London was gripped by a one-man murder wave unheard of since the days of Jack the Ripper.
As well as working as a prison psychologist, Professor Mike Berry has worked with police forces across the UK on some of the biggest serial murder investigations of the past 20 years.
Profilers can't say John Smith did this murder, but what they can say is the likely characteristics are that at this height, this weight, this age group, this ethnicity group. They can talk about the style of killing, the type of job the person has. And what you're doing is basically doing a job description for the most likely candidates for having committed murder. When we're talking about serial killers, we're talking about a different category altogether. And what we're trying to do is build up a pattern to show how that killer is operating. And the more killings that killer does, the more you can build up a pattern, and that's what we're saying. Here's the pattern, here's the linkage, these are the areas that you should be looking at. We spend a lot of time being very methodical in what we're doing. We visit the scene of the crime to gain information and to see about aspects that give us some indication of the mind of the killer.
One of the first things Mike does is to revisit the locations where the victims were found. Today, he's assisted by journalist Robin Gerossi, who has written extensively about these crimes.
This is the sort of Chiswick area. We're coming down towards Hammersmith. I think back then, certainly up that way a bit more, it was much more of a working area with factories, wharves, cranes, barges coming up here, unloading stuff. All that's now gone. But this is the scene where the first two bodies were discovered. Hannah Tailford, the first victim, she'd said to her daughter on her last night that her partner saw her, she said to her young daughter, "Would you like a new mummy?" And then she'd gone out that evening and he'd never seen her again. And 9 days later, she was found here by the river. She was in a terrible state. She was seen several times wandering around Paddington, around the coffee stalls, basically. She talked about hoping that she could marry somebody, obviously wanted to get out of the lifestyle. But one or two people had seen her starving, and one young couple bought her a dinner one day and gave her 5 shillings to try and sort of cheer her up because she was so depressed. It was a really hard slog. She'd met a lot of very nasty people and really been treated very badly quite often. I mean, what kind of toll that must take on a young person. And let's face it, you know, they had very little education, they'd come from very unpromising backgrounds, and here they are, they come to the big city and having this hard scrabble life, dealing with lots of strangers down back alleys, and then finally she crossed paths with a killer.
Any hopes that the murder of Hannah was an isolated incident were dashed when over 2 months later, the naked body of 26-year-old Irene Lockwood was also washed up.
Can you tell me a bit more about Irene Lockwood?
Yes, she'd come down from Nottinghamshire as a young woman. She very quickly picked up a lot of convictions for prostitution. She'd been moving around a lot. She'd had a lot of clients. She'd had a life of using amphetamines and drinking and trying to sort of gee herself up to go out and work on the street. But again, she'd gone to a pub in Chiswick. The landlord there positively identified her as having been in the pub. And then she, the very next day, I think, was found by a police patrol. And he pulled her as the tide was going out. She'd been stranded on the foreshore. She was obviously unclothed. I suspect he lived nearby. He knew the area very well, and it's occurred to him that this would be a great spot to just come down here late at night, reverse up to the river edge and let them go, and let the river do its job in washing away any evidence that may have been left behind.
The river visit is offering Mike an invaluable insight into the dark mind of Jack the Stripper.
One of the things that struck me straight away is that this killer knows the area very well. At the time, it would have been quite an industrial area. It would have been dark at night. There would not been many people. It was in the middle of winter, being cold, wet, miserable. So he would be able to come here, bring his car down to the slipway, and then dispose of the body, knowing that he's unlikely to be seen by anybody. One of the things that we know is that people escalate. Serial killers get better and better. Most people do not think about disposal. This man has planned where he's going to dispose of the bodies and how he's going to dispose it. To actually commit your first murder and leave a body the way that the killer's left these bodies makes me wonder whether he's done something before.
Following the discovery of Irene Lockwood's body, an increased police presence was to be found along the river. But any hopes the authorities had in deterring the killer from killing again were dashed when another body turned up, this time not in the river, but in a suburban alley near Swincombe Avenue, Brentford, 3 miles to the west of Chiswick. The victim this time was 22-year-old Helen Barthélemy from Blackpool.
She was my sister. I only knew her up until the age of about 10, but I always remember her fondly because she was such a good sister. I remember in Blackpool she took me up and down the seafront in a Zodiac with the top down, and she had like a rock and roll dress on, you know, with spots on, and she had a lovely smile, and she always had her hair usually up. Whenever I saw her, she used to have it in like one of these rock and roll beehives, they called them, and she was beautiful. She was, you know, she's a beautiful sister, really. The first I heard of Helen being in London was when my brother told me that she'd been murdered. We were both in tears, and my mother was distraught. I remember she was in the bedroom and I could hear her crying her eyes out. For Helen to be portrayed the way she was, I think, was disgraceful, because the woman that the papers described bore no resemblance to the person I knew. I can't understand why the papers portrayed them all like that, because they were all people. They're all somebody's mothers and daughters. There's actually no facts that to my mind, that have been produced about Helen's murder, apart from the fact that she was found strangled, naked and dead, and her teeth removed at the front, and that's the only facts that I've ever been able to find out.
The post-mortem of Helen took place over 50 years ago. The team have obtained a copy of the post-mortem report and digitally recreated an autopsy using a system called anatomage.
What did the post-mortem say about her, Lisa?
Right, body found naked on a rubbish heap. Pattern of knickers and bra outlined by hypostasis on her back. Death from asphyxia due to strangulation, probably due to twisted clothing around her neck. There were abrasions on her neck, probably caused by victim's fingernails.
You mentioned scratches to the neck, and presumably, Bernard, that would be where she was trying to fight against being strangled.
Often scratches are due to the victim, not the assailant. The assailant tends to cause bruises and deep damage, but the scratches are often the victim.
But I wonder about this punch, Siobhan. What about the punch? What does that tell us about what happened to her?
So she obviously was mistreated prior to the asphyxiation as well. So there was a blow to her cheekbone on her left side and also to her nose. So that suggests that a punch from this side here. But we don't know, that doesn't have any indication of the handedness of the assailant or anything like that, because it could just be the location, the orientation of the head.
And Lisa, this is interesting because this body has not been placed in water, and therefore that allows us to get a bit more information. What other information do we have?
Well, actually, this is the first lady that we had some forensic evidence found. She had flecks of paint found on her body, paint that was used in automobile manufacturing at the time.
The paint flecks on Helen's body offered police their first breakthrough in the case. Closer analysis revealed that the airborne drops of paint had come from a spray gun, typically used in the automotive trade. Given that Helen's body had been dumped a week after she'd been last seen alive, police believed her body had been stored, perhaps in a garage. But at the time, detectives were puzzled why Jack the Stripper was no longer dumping his victims in the Thames, now instead opting for the back roads of suburbia.
I find it fascinating coming to see the scene of where he's disposed of her body. I mean, to me, it looks so strange. We see pictures of the police looking over into the garden along this track here, and I'd want to know why he only went a short distance in. You know, was she heavy? Well, we know she wasn't heavy. We know that she was only 8 stone. So if he's a reasonably fit man, he should be able to lift up and carry her. I'm really interested to find out where this track goes, because I want to know why he didn't choose a better hiding place. If he wanted to hide her, I would have thought he would come up here and find lots of places where he could hide her. Was it because she was too heavy? Was it because he was panicking? Or whether he just didn't care? Or was it even the situation that he wanted her to be found? One thought that's come to me is he did panic because we have a very good account of how he drove onto one of the other roads and nearly caused an accident by the speed he was driving. So maybe he was panicking and just literally chose a spot and dumped her. And I think that was his biggest mistake. He's clearly lost the plot a bit. He's lost control. And this is a man who's very much into control. Serial killers get better. The more they kill, they get better, they improve. They're elaborating the system, they escalate the violence, or they escalate the sophistication of their violence. So you often find they get less physically violent and more psychologically violent. They terrorize their victim without having to be physical. But what's interesting in this one is that she seems to put up a bit of a fight, because there is accounts from the pathologist of her having facial damage, which would suggest she put up a fight. One of the things that went through my mind was it's very similar to some of the back lanes that we saw in Abertillery.
Much like the discovery of Helen's body some 40 years later, Jones had left his victim on display in broad daylight to be discovered by an innocent passerby. As police made door-to-door inquiries following the discovery of Helen's body, several people commented on having heard a car speeding away in the early hours of the morning. Police believed she'd been dumped in the lane by someone driving a vehicle, and one eyewitness put forward that the car was a Hillman Husky. Speaking with anyone who drove such a vehicle became a focus for the police at the time. Retired Abertillery detective Jerry English has managed to track down some old colleagues who were involved in the hunt for the mystery man and his vehicle.
Jim, if I can come to you first, I understand you were a member of the Special Patrol Group at that particular time.
Yeah.
So what was it like for you then as a copper? Yeah, initially?
Well, we were on the SPG, which was newly formed. We were brought in purely to do the groundwork because of the shortage of CID. And our job was to go and try and watch prostitutes when they were picking up punters, and then watch them and see if they get dropped back. And there was a log kept on this. And one of the things we were particularly told to look out for was vans. And apparently, we didn't know at the time, but the bodies had marks when they were found. They had blood marks on where they'd been lying. And they were consistent with, I think it was a Husky van. So what we did is they told us, right, get down. And there's a place in Hyde Park where the females, the girls, were taking their punters and they were having oral sex in the lay-by. And ironically, it was called Gobbler's Gulch. It was a slang expression that was used. And for some reasons that we didn't really know, the girls that were found dead had had oral sex. And we had an observation van where you could sit in, nobody would see you obviously, and watch and see what was going on. And we'd see who came in the car, go through the business, so we'd speak to somebody down the road and be able to follow the girl and the man and see if she get dropped off. And then the squad that was dealing with it would go and interview the guys, maybe a bit to their embarrassment at home when they get a knock on the door and saying you were blah, blah, blah.
Despite the increase in police resources, there was still no turning point in the case. 3 months passed without further incident, but all that changed on the 14th of July 1964 when a fourth victim was found in Chiswick. Her name was Mary Fleming. A Hillman Husky had once again been spotted leaving the scene. Mary's post-mortem reveals that the injuries she sustained were almost identical to the previous victims. This proves to me that the killer had by now established a definitive signature. But the violence towards his victims was escalating, as was the body count.
And so we have in here the location of the bruise that was delivered with apparently stunning intensity according to the literature.
So this sounds like punching, doesn't it, Bernard?
One or more punches in that left side of the face, one into the eye. Well, a fist could cover the whole lot, actually.
If there's more punching to the left side of the face, does that tell us something about the perpetrator in relation to whether he's left or right-handed?
He's more likely to be right-handed.
More likely.
You can't rely on him.
And paint flecks again on this body, I believe, Lisa.
Yes, indeed. Yes, this was the second victim where the paint spots were again found on the body.
And we've got any issues in relation to teeth? Is this another victim where teeth are removed or there are teeth missing?
Yes, it says 12 teeth missing, 10 from the upper jaw, not stated if they were old or recent extractions.
There has been some speculation that by this stage the killer is also storing the body prior to disposing of the victim's body. What might that imply, do you think? Why would he want to store it? What does he gain by storing the body?
Perhaps time to dispose of the body in a way in which it's less likely to be recovered.
As a criminologist, I always feel that if they're storing the body, it gives them greater amounts of time to be with the victim, and that might satisfy all kinds of sexual needs. There has been speculation that the teeth are being removed because the killer enjoys oral sex and he's choking these women through using his penis. Is that possible, Bernard, in relation to the pathology that we've got?
Not really, no.
No.
I mean, there's no way of validating it or denying it.
The death of Mary Fleming took on even greater significance to the investigation, as it was to yield what remains to this day the case's only eyewitness to any of the murders. Detective Jerry English has tracked down a man who had his own close brush with Jack the Stripper just moments before Mary lost her life.
Yeah, so Peter, you live local to the area, you've worked the area, spent most of your life here. What can you tell us about the actual crime as you saw it then?
I've been out with a young lady. I think we'd been to the pictures. As we were walking down, let's say we was on the right-hand side of the road. On the left-hand side, there's a garage setback, and there was a couple in there. The girl, I can recall, she had dark hair. The man, he had a hat on. But
when you say he was wearing a hat,
yeah.
Was it trilby? Or
yeah, I think it was a trilby.
A trilby type.
Yeah.
Trilby type, as opposed to a flat cap.
Yeah, as a flat cap, it was a trilby.
Right.
And he had a cream type Mac, Harold Wilson type thing, and he was disturbing her clothing. I could see his hand on her clothing. I couldn't see his face. In the paper, there's this girl dead in the garage, sitting down, and you know, it's a horror story. You know, I'm assuming that he's the murderer and he's killed her in that garage just after we've walked past. I've gone to Acton Police and I've told them what I've seen and I've given them a statement. I don't think he was that tall because I'm thinking he was about the same size as the woman. He didn't look any taller. He didn't look, you know, because he wasn't towering over the woman. But it's frightening to think that he could have been the murderer, and I'm sure he probably was, you know.
Has it ever occurred to you that you have witnessed Jack the Stripper actually?
Well, it comes home now that you've said it that I was actually there. The policeman said at the time that we probably witnessed the murderer.
As the hunt for the killer continued, there was no let-up for the police with the discovery of a fifth victim, Frances Brown. Once again, she'd been diminutive in height, her teeth had been removed, and the flecks of car paint were found upon her body. On the night of her murder, Frances was seen getting into a car with a client. Only weeks earlier, she had shared with friends a chilling encounter she had had of a car she had got into and the man who had owned it.
She immediately had a very bad feeling about the guy. He then said to her that he was a police officer and showed her a Metropolitan Police card. He said to her something quite disturbing. He'd asked her if she'd heard about the series of killings, and again this got her hackles up a bit, and she said, well, yes. And then he described how the women had been killed, which was that they'd had their clothes pulled up over their head and had somehow been strangled, which was actually quite close to how the victims were killed. He, in the end, ended up giving her some money, but she said they didn't actually have sex, and she managed to get out and just walk away, basically.
Her friend, who was also working the streets that night, provided a police sketch artist with a likeness of the driver. This drawing may now be compared to two pictures we have of Harold Jones. The likeness, to my mind, is uncanny. Several months after the body of Frances Brown was found, a sixth victim was discovered. 29-year-old Bridget O'Hara was found behind a shed on the Heron Industrial Estate in North Acton.
Well, I went to the stores here just to get something out of it, you see, some soap. And then coming out, I decided to have a look around the back of the store, the shed itself. Well, I found this body, or so I thought at first. And just see the legs, where the bottom of the legs were the feet.
The killing had all the hallmarks of Jack the Stripper. Teeth had been removed and flecks of paint were found on her naked body. The flecks of paint were now seen as being the most powerful piece of evidence, and efforts were multiplied to trace the origins of the paint now found on 4 of the victims' bodies. The police knew it was from a type of paint used in the automotive industry, but it was also mixed with a unique combination of other fibres and particles. Detectives were now convinced that if they could find this spray paint shop, they could find the killer. Pat O'Connor was one of the frontline detectives trained to collect paint samples from hundreds of garages across London. He's agreed to speak to fellow ex-Scotland Yard detective Jackie Malton.
We were allocated an area of Shepherd's Bush going west towards Acton, and we would go out with a roll of sellotape. We were looking for a residue that was believed to have been on the bodies of the deceased. And we would then take a dust sample from a door, a windowsill. We would then submit that for forensic examination.
What were the results of the samples that you submitted to the laboratory?
A bit of elation that it was positive.
One that you had taken was positive?
They were positive.
And the name of the premises?
It would be on the industrial estate of Acton here, which
the
is
Heron Industrial Estate.
Correct.
Okay. Do you recall whether there were any observations done by police officers, stake out the garage, have a look at who frequented?
No.
Is that a no? It wasn't done. No. It wasn't done.
No. And I was looking at this place, and it would be a place where, as far as I was concerned, an easy place to dump a body.
This was the premises of Shaw and Kilburn Automotives on the Heron Industrial Estate in Acton. Detectives were able to eventually discover that the bodies weren't stored in a paint shop. Adjacent to the spray paint garage was a disused electricity transformer shed that was part of the abandoned Napier Aero engine factory. Ventilation shafts in the spray paint shop had sucked the flecks of paint out into the open where they had settled in the empty building next door. This was where the killer had been storing the bodies. Much of the Heron trading estate has been bulldozed to make way for new units, but one row of buildings that was part of the old estate remains standing today, and its layout is identical to the row where the spray paint garage once stood. Jackie and Mike are paying a visit to the location. Both believe it could answer some questions critical to the case, including whether the killer worked in the area and consequently knew that there was an array of empty buildings where he could work under cover of darkness.
You can see that he must have broken in the door. Maybe he had a key so he could get into it.
But look how far it goes back though, Mike. It goes back quite a way. What do you think that is, 50 yards?
50 yards, yeah.
40 yards?
So,
and this was the mirror of the spray shop.
Paint shop, yeah. So the paint's coming out of there, somehow working its way into here, because when he's had Mary Fleming here, there's paint goblets on her body and things like that. So clearly he's had her in there for a while, but he must have been really confident he could come up here and nobody was going to bother him.
Everything is hidden in plain sight in this inquiry, which always intrigues me, because here's this little building, which is transformer building, insignificant but significant.
But at night time, he's got to carry a dead body in there.
But 4 times he does it.
Yeah.
4 times.
So he's obviously feeling more and more confident, and the conditions must be reasonably dry in there so they're not decomposing too quickly, because otherwise people, even with the paint, you'd smell a body going off.
He's also confident that nobody else presumably has access to this building if he's going to keep a body in there for 4 weeks, and he keeps coming back and he keeps coming back and he keeps coming back, which indicates there's an area of confidence about him, a bit of arrogance, feeling that he's safe here, hidden in plain sight again.
Even the worst comes to it, he could, if he did get stopped, he'd blag it. He'd blag it and say, oh, I'm just doing a check on something, you know. Nobody's going to query it.
No, and nobody's going to say, oh, let's have a look round here, mate, to see what you're at, are they? Because it's just a transformer
And
building.
the police wouldn't even look. This is probably the last place they would look, because they're thinking somewhere more practical.
He's got quite a criminal mind, this killer.
The whole of this, to me, shows somebody with a lot of planning, a lot of skills. Occasionally it goes wrong. We've seen examples where he nearly got caught. But nevertheless, he's acting under a lot of stress and coping extremely well under it.
I feel sad about it, because I feel sad that these, you know, poor women have lost their lives, ended up in this building that is quite ugly, in the middle of an industrial estate, alone. It's quite sad, isn't it?
It is sad. It's sad. And it's sad for the families to think that's how their wives, mothers, sisters or daughters ended up.
Yeah, I'd be mortified if it was some relative of mine that I had ended their lives and they were stored in here. I mean, murder's bad enough anyway, but the kind of sinister dirtiness of the building, there's something that is quite horrible about it. There's an alleyway there.
Yeah, let's have a
Shall we
look
have
down
a
there and
look
see
at the
what
alleyway?
I mean, one of the questions I've got to ask myself is, what did he do with them? this is the back of the building, and here clearly is where the paint's coming out. What we know is this is a paint shop. They're spraying cars is that very fine spray, and that's what the police eventually find.
The discovery of the building Jack the Stripper was using as his base still didn't lead the police to him. The case was given a huge shake-up with the arrival of the yard's most senior detective, Superintendent John DeRose, known as 4-Day Johnny due to his reputation for solving a case before the working week was out.
In any prostitute murder, you start off without any suspect as a rule. And with 6 of them who had evaded being seen at any time during that period, which was a whole year, it was a particularly difficult problem. Well, we set about employing women police officers as prostitutes, dressed up in a flashy sort of manner, creeping around the dark streets and so on.
Well, we were asked to dress in a kind of provocative, kind of more sexy way than would be my normal way to dress. We were supposed to try to engage with the curb crawlers, and they would slow down when they saw us walking, and then we would stop, and you'd put your head in the window, they'd put the window down, and sort of, can't remember exact words, but kind of, you know, "You all right, darling? Do you want a job?" And that kind of, "Well, what do you want and where will we go?"
What were you trying to elicit from them?
Mostly what it was that they wanted us to be doing, and then of course once we'd found out what they were like, we then had to not get in the car and go with them, didn't we? So there had to be a break-off point where we had to say, well, that's not suitable and that's not convenient, or, oh, I don't do that.
Were you looking for any particular kind of vehicles?
I know that they were looking for mostly vans, but we weren't told all of that at the time. It was just generally anybody that stopped and wanted to engage with a prostitute, really.
Did you have to get the registration number of the car?
Yes, and you couldn't remember it all, so I remember having a little pencil in my pocket and just a little bit of paper and trying to write down car numbers without it showing.
For these women to end up how they did, I want to get to the bottom of it, because they deserve it. They deserve to know who the killer is. I know they're dead, but their relatives aren't all dead.
Oh no, that's true, isn't it? Yes.
As time went on, of course, we realised that the suspect, whoever he was, must be reading the news of what was going on, what the activities of police and so on. And so we got the press and the radio and television on our side, and we gave them stories every day. This was our one-way communication with the murderer. And we hoped by this means to start him up, to get him frightened, to make him run, to do something which would point the finger towards his guilt.
DeRose then implemented an enormous stop and search operation across a 2-mile radius in West London, but not a single bona fide suspect emerged. This was complemented by the questioning of thousands of men in the Acton area, an area where DeRose was convinced the killer either lived or worked, and had known that the Napier factory was abandoned and would be the perfect place to hide a body. DeRose eventually put together a list of suspects.
The list started off with, I think, 20. It was one of 20 men, we said. It came down to 16, to 12, to 6, to 3 eventually.
These suspects were never made public, but those working closely on the case under DeRose were party to this confidential information. Pat O'Connor was one such detective.
Was there any indication given to you, Pat, as to where the inquiry was going and any named prime suspects?
Yes, there was a name put forward to me personally, and it was a man by the name of Mungo Ireland.
And when you say that was given to you personally, this was not in a general briefing, but who gave you the information?
Probably somebody that I knew on the squad that knew.
A little bit, who needs to know gets the information?
Yes.
So what was your belief about the prime suspect, Mungo Ireland?
This could have been the individual who committed those murders.
And what happened to Mungo Ireland?
I believe he committed suicide.
Eventually, it didn't have the effect that we actually desired, but he obviously became so frightened, he took his own life.
But this claim that Mungo Ireland was the killer was certainly not the official position of the Metropolitan Police. The case then, as now, remains open and unsolved.
Rose gives the impression that they'd pressured him and they'd cornered this guy and he had eventually killed himself. But that didn't happen because the police weren't aware of him and his suicide until 4 months after the final murder. They discovered that he'd been working on the heroin trading estate at that point, but they never really came up with any evidence to connect him to any of the victims. There was no forensic evidence. He was never interviewed. And it's clear that the police who were in charge of the investigation at that point never really considered him to be a very serious prospect. When one of the victims disappeared, he was in Scotland doing a job there as a cleaner. Now the Met asked Dundee Police to check that, and the Dundee Police came back and said, yes, that's right, we've checked with his employers and he was at work that day.
The most compelling piece of evidence that the police had were that the same flecks of car paint had been found on 4 of the victims, meaning they'd been killed by the same man. Mungo Ireland had a watertight alibi for when one of the victims was murdered, which, by a process of elimination, removes him from the frame for all of the killings. John DeRose's identification of Mungo Ireland certainly wasn't based on any hard evidence. It was founded on something far less empirical.
No CCTV, no DNA analysis, no mobile phone data. So in the 60s, you really had, apart from...
Instinct.
So in the days that you were a police officer and myself, we didn't have those support services. And so it was based on detection, on interviewing.
And gut feeling.
And you think gut feeling?
Yes.
So in this particular case, do you think Mr. DeRose went on gut feeling about Mungo Ireland?
Well, I couldn't say that that's only a opinion of mine. I've always say he would have weighed up the situation, what evidence was there at this particular time, and his own conclusions.
How long do you think, after you found the samples, in relation to the murder of Bridget O'Hara and the death of Mungo Ireland, how long do you think you remained, not just you, but the rest of the detectives, on the inquiry thereafter?
We had a get-together.
A get-together?
Yes, a get-together, an office meeting. And Mr. DeRose was going on holiday. And thereafter, it then petered out, and I returned not long after it was wound down.
What was the information that you had given to you about the reason Mungo Ireland killed those prostitutes?
His access of the area and his knowledge of the area surrounding where those bodies would be found or picked up.
Any concrete evidence?
No.
Thank you.
With the killer never caught, the Jack the Stripper case remains the biggest unsolved serial murder case in British history. So who was Jack the Stripper? Could he really have been Harold Jones? Do the signatures of the killers really match? Next time on Dark Son. The investigation makes an extraordinary breakthrough when we make contact with Harold Jones's daughter, who was stunned to learn that her father was a double child murderer, and also reveals some chilling details about his life in London.
Was he afraid that if he stayed and argued with Mum, he would have killed her?
And we present our findings of a year-long investigation to Scotland Yard detective Alan Jackaman. Will he believe there's enough evidence against Harold Jones to warrant him being named as the prime suspect and the case being reopened?